Well, hello again, my friends, and welcome once more to the Invisible College, where at the moment we're investigating the Grail legends. That's a big part of the mysteries of Britain from just after the time of Jesus Christ. We're exploring this whole subject of, did Joseph of Arimathea come to Britain with the Holy Grail, and what was it, and what's this all about? And in the process of doing that, we're first exploring the history of that period of time, because it's a very strange thing that not that long after the crucifixion, Britain was invaded by the Romans. So we had this, the two ends of the Roman Empire, you would say, somehow connecting together in this great mystery. So we're going to investigate that and explore that. But today I'm going to do the first or third of these lectures, which is part 3, and this is about the Emperor Claudius and King Caratacus. Now I'll explain who King Caratacus is to you as we go along. You've probably heard of Claudius. If you haven't seen it, I recommend that you watch the series, TV series with Derek Jacobi as Claudius. Robert Graves' book turned into a TV series called I, Claudius. And if you haven't seen that, I do recommend it to understand this period, perhaps even better. But we're talking about the British aspect of it, because Claudius, the unlikely character, never thought he was going to be emperor, because of circumstances really beyond his control. It was forced on him. And this quiet academic who wanted to study history, or did study history, wrote history, found himself in charge of the Roman Empire. And one of the first things he did was to carry out an invasion of Britain. And he was successful where his ancestor, Julius Caesar, hadn't been. Julius Caesar had attempted this in 55 and 54 BC, and it wasn't until 43 AD that Claudius actually was successful, and he did better than Caesar even. So we're going to explore that a little bit. We have been talking about the Claudian invasion in the earlier episodes of this. I'll put a link down below to where you can find those episodes on YouTube if you want to catch up, if you're new to this. But this one is part 3, and we're going to explore the whole situation between Claudius and King Caratacus. Now, in the last episode, we explored the legend of a Roman king. Actually, I'm going to take off the writing because I think it's distracting for you. I'll just be reading it. So if you see me looking down, that's what I'm doing. I'm reading what's written. And in the last episode, we explored the legend of a Roman period king of Britain called Arviragus. He was the younger son of Cunvelin, who ruled over southeast England just before the invasion of Claudius. Cunvelin, I should say, is the guy who's often called Cunobelinus, or he becomes Cymbeline, or Cymbeline, in Shakespearean play. Anyway, Arviragus' elder brother, Guiderius, was killed in battle with the Romans. Guiderius is his name in British, in Welsh, is Gwared. And he's often talked about, and people get him mixed up with Arviragus. He's not the same person. He was the elder brother. And both of them were sons of Cunobelinus, Cunvelin. So anyway, Guiderius was killed in battle with the Romans. Arviragus carried on the fight, but eventually accepted peace terms. He retained his throne, extending his rule over most of southern England, what we call southern England now. England at that time was called Logres. In return, he acknowledged Rome's overlordship. Now, I covered all that in the last episode, so I'm not going to go into that in any detail here, but just to catch up. Britannia Prima was probably the extent of Arviragus' agreed kingdom. It's roughly south of the River Thames and east of Fosse Way. Fosse Way is a big road that runs up in the southwest. It goes from Exeter up to Bath, and then it goes all the way up, across England to the River Trent and up by Lincoln and beyond. So it's a lot of it's very straight, typical Roman road, but it didn't start off that way, as we'll talk about it in a bit later. Britannia Prima would have included some of north of the Thames as well, the lands of the Trinovantes and the Cativellani. We'll talk about them also as we go on. But anyway, it's a big chunk of southeast Britain that Arviragus retained his kingship to carry on with. Now, living in the 12th century was Geoffrey of Monmouth, and I've talked about him a lot as well in the earlier chapters. In 1136, he published a book called Historia Regum Britanniae, or The History of the Kings of Britain. It caused a sensation. The story of Arviragus and his relationship with the Emperor Claudius is told in detail in Geoffrey's book. And again, we covered that. Indeed, he provides us with details not found elsewhere. And in part 2 of this series, I produced the evidence, both textual and archaeological, that proves Geoffrey was telling the truth about Arviragus. He may have embroidered his translation with extra details, but this was done to give it more romantic appeal for his Norman audience. He was, after all, telling a story. So he's been given an old book in Welsh. It's actually the Welsh Annals he's been given, which is a kind of chronology of what happened each year. And he's been asked by his superior to translate this, and he's done so, but he's done it in a more elaborate format. Taking the stories and adding colour to them. It's like he's been given a black and white document and he's coloured it in, saying, for instance, that it might say Arviragus married Genuissa, a lady called Genuissa. But then he elaborates and he says, oh, such a romantic, they were so in love and she was so beautiful. So he gets a bit flowery in his writing. But that doesn't mean the story's not true. It's written in a storytelling fashion. Given that Geoffrey goes into detail about Arviragus, it seems strange that he makes no mention of Caratacus, a more famous British leader at the time of the Claudian invasion of Britain. And this seems doubly strange as Caratacus, who's called Caradoc in Welsh, was like Geoffrey, Welsh. Geoffrey was Welsh. He came from Monmouth, when Monmouth was at that time in Wales. Indeed, had Geoffrey been alive at the time of the Claudian invasion, Caratacus would have been his overlord. So why is he not mentioned, this famous Welsh hero in this part of Wales, his part? Omitting the story of Caratacus, if not exactly proof, is strong evidence that Geoffrey was not, as critics suggest, writing fiction of his own. Had the book been his original work, he would surely have spent time relating the story of a king who, for him, was a local hero. So why, you wouldn't ignore a local hero. It's not as though Caratacus was forgotten. He's still remembered in Wales. And he's in other textbooks and histories. So why did he leave it out? Instead, he ignores Caratacus entirely, focusing instead on a London area hero, Arviragus. Arviragus was from the London area. This rather suggests that the original author of the old book that he was translating was a Briton from what is now England rather than Wales. Yes, perhaps he was from, the more southwesterly part of Britain, nearer to Brittany, Cornwall, Devon, but he doesn't seem to have been really up on his Welsh history. That's what it seems. Now, I'm giving you here a family tree. I'll put this in so you can have a look. So this gives you the immediate family tree of Caratacus, the king of the Silures. Silures were the tribe of southeast Wales, mainly Glamorgan and Gwent, but also extending into Monmouthshire, a bit of Gloucestershire as well, and maybe a little bit westwards too, into Carmarthenshire. The immediate family tree of Caratacus and kings of the Silures. You have Clear. He's the son of Baran. He's called Clear Clediath, which means Lear of the buck teeth. It must have had funny teeth or something. Anyway, he had a son called Bran, and Bran is called Vendigade in Welsh, which means blessed. So he's Bran the Blessed. And he has a son called Caradoc. He had other sons too, but Caradoc is the one we're focusing on. And he has a son called Culin, and he has a son called Coel, and he has a son called Llwfamawa, which means Lucius the Great. And we know about him in AD 167, so it's some time later than this Caradoc. Bishop Eleutherius of Rome, equivalent of a pope, they didn't call them popes then, sent the mission of Saints Duvan and Fagan to Britain. So that's recorded everywhere that he sent them. And there's actually a church of St. Duvan and another one of St. Fagan near Cardiff in Glamorgan. So that seems to be the sort of area they were sent to. I covered that myself in the book I wrote with Alan Wilson and Baron Blackett on a lot of this material and a lot more as well about King Arthur and so on. But so it does seem that Duvan and Fagan seem to have been sent to Wales rather than to England, as most people think. Well, that's where their churches are anyway, that they founded. Unfortunately, we do not have to look very far to find the story of Caratacus. It is told in great detail by none other than Tacitus. We've already met this Roman historian in the previous lecture of this series. Yeah, we met Tacitus. He's a famous Roman historian who lived not long after this period, in the 1st century AD. So he's a very reliable historian. It's unfortunate that little bits of his history to do with Claudius are left out. We lost them. But a lot of his stuff has survived, and from what he's survived, we do understand quite a bit. So we've already met him, and he was the son-in-law of Agricola, General Agricola, who became governor of Britain. In AD 77, this Roman general, who had previous experience of commanding armies in Britain, was sent back by Emperor Vespasian to be governor of the Romanized territories. So Vespasian was one of the generals at the time of Claudius, who in the invasion of Britain, particularly dealing with the southwest, parts of the invasion, Dorset, bits of Devon, that sort of area. He did other things in Sussex and so on as well. But Vespasian became emperor himself, and he knew Tacitus, who had been one of his more junior officers at the time of the British invasion. So he sent him back to become governor in 77 AD. Vespasian died in 79, that's only 2 years later. But Agricola continued with his governorship under his son, the Emperor Titus. However, Titus also died just 2 years later in AD 81. After that, his younger brother Domitian took over as emperor. Well, that was bad news for old Agricola, because Domitian got very jealous of the successes of Agricola had in Britain and called him back. And he after that, his life was pretty obscure. But he was lucky to keep it alive, because Domitian was a horrible man. He was spying on everyone and totally paranoid, and a lot of people, particularly the aristocracy and the senator class, lost their lives under him because he was afraid of them. A bit like Putin today, I guess. Anyway, Geoffrey's omission, that's a mission about talking about Caratacus, may be down to the fact that historians who lived much later than Tacitus confused Caratacus with Arviragus. And this is a mistake. They're not the same man, they're not the same person, and nor are they brothers. If you look up Caratacus online, he's also known as Caratacus, or in Welsh as Caradoc, you'll likely be told he was a son of Cunobelinus. Now, we talked about Cunvelin Cunobelinus having two sons, Guiderius and Arviragus. Caratacus is neither of them, and this is a confusion that's crept in later. And this information, which is repeated in many history books and even the Encyclopedia Britannica, the Encyclopedia Britannica, it's often wrong, is entirely wrong. All Welsh texts and genealogies, as well as Tacitus, tell us very specifically that Caradoc was king of a southern Welsh tribe called the Silures. He was over-king. They had, you had kings, or loads of kings in different places, but then you could have an over-king who was a war leader. One Welsh name for that was a Cadwallader, leader in battles, who would command all the armies of all the tribes working together if there was an external enemy. So he was one of those. He was over-king of a confederacy of the other Welsh tribes, as well as some further tribes in Logres, the land we now call England. So England wasn't called England until the Anglo-Saxons came there, the Angles, and gave their name to it and called it England. Before that, it was called Logres in Welsh. Well, you probably heard of Clogres in Arthurian stories, or Logres as we would call it. So that was, however, he was not of the London-centred dynasty of Cunobelinus. So that's very important to know that. Britain was not all one great big state ruled from London like it is now. So anyway, he was not from the London area, that's the point here. The man most likely responsible for misidentifying Caratacus is Dio Cassius, sometimes called Cassius Dio. He was a Romanized Greek who lived in Rome during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries AD. His books, 80 volumes in all, were written in Greek. They cover the entire history of Rome and the Roman Empire up until AD 235, when he died. So Dio Cassius, we're looking at a man who is living in the late 2nd and the early part of the 3rd centuries AD, not in the 1st century, as was Tacitus. In Book 60, lots of books he wrote, but they're very short books, actually. In Book 60, he treats of the Claudian invasion of Britain. However, he confuses Caratacus with Guiderius, that's Guarid, when he writes the following. I'm going to quote here from Book 60. When at last he, General Aulus Plautius, we would know that from the context, did find them, that's the Britons hiding in forests and swamps, he was talking about that in the previous paragraph, He conquered first Caratacus and next Togodumnus, children of Cunobelinus, who was dead. Well, that's wrong. I mean, Caratacus and Togodumnus were not conquered, immediately. And Caratacus was not conquered before Togodumnus. Togodumnus is another name for Argyravus. And Cunobelinus was not his brother. His brother was Guiderius, and he was conquered before Togodumnus. He was killed, actually. After the flight of these kings, he attached by treaty a portion of the Bodani, ruled by a nation of the Catuolani. Now you ask yourself, who are the Bodani and who are the Catuolani? Well, I'm going to tell you. He then goes on to say that, having defeated Caratacus and Togodumnus, the Romans, under Plautius, pursued the Britons to the other side of the Thames. There they inflicted a crushing defeat on them, after having first called to Claudius for reinforcements. He says that this battle, which involved elephants brought over by Claudius, was fought near Camulodunum, modern-day Colchester. Right, so he's saying there must have been a battle elsewhere where these guys was earlier routed. And then they retreat over the Thames, and then there's another big battle at Colchester where elephants are used that have been brought over by Claudius. Well, you'll read about that in every history book you look at. But actually, I don't think Claudius ever went north of the Thames. He came to the Chichester and possibly Portsmouth area, just over the Channel. He didn't spend more than 10 days in Britain. He may have brought over some elephants and reinforcements, but he didn't stay himself. Anyway, the first battles were fought there. We talked about that in the earlier lecture, the previous lecture. You'll find out much more about that. What Dio Cassius writes is a confused mishmash into which he seems to have added influences of his own. Had he read Tacitus, he would have known that Caratacus was not from the same tribe as Cunobelinus or his son Arviragus, also known as Cogidumnus or Togodumnus. The elder brother of Arviragus was called Guiderius. Well, I've told you that. Gwarid in Welsh. And he was killed in the first battle with the Romans, probably fought near Chichester, not Colchester. By contrast, Caradoc, was king of the Silures, and this was a completely different tribe living in Wales, not southern England. I'm sorry to go on about this, but it is very important that you understand this, because it is so misrepresented. Moreover, Arviragus did not die soon after. He went on to sign a treaty with Claudius, who built for him a magnificent palace at Chichester. The tribe Dio calls Bodani has to be identified with the Dobunni. Their territory encompassed much of Gloucestershire, Somerset and Devon. It seems that by treaty, a portion of this land was assigned by Claudius to his now client king, Arviragus. This portion was very likely included the town of Bath. There wasn't a big city there, but there was a settlement at Bath. The Britons were really keen on this hot water, hot water bathing at Bath for your rheumatism and arthritis. They knew all about that. This portion was very likely included the town of Bath and the Dobunni capital of Corinium Dubanorum, Corinium of the Dobunni. Today we call this latter city Cirencester. So they're in Gloucester, and you can go and visit, them today, and you will see there was a Roman presence in both of those towns very strongly. Finally, Dio's Catuolani is the Catuolani tribe. The people descended from the house of Casualanus. Caswallon. He was the High King who nearly a century earlier had led the Britons in their fight against Caesar. Caswallon himself was a brother of King Lud, or Clud, of the London area. So the death of Clud led to the Caesar's invasion, and we talked about that earlier as well. So Caswallon's tribe was really an offshoot of the Trinovantes. I should say that after Julius Caesar invaded and he retreated and went back, but he made a deal that Tenuvan, or Tenovantius, that was a son of Lud, should become king. Caswallon, sort of, his uncle actually, of Tenovantius, went back to his own centre, which was what we now call St. Albans. And the people who went with him were the Catiwalani, the people of Caswallon. He took his household and his camp followers and people who were with him to this separate place. But they remained an offshoot of the Trinovantes. Trinovantes means the people of the New Troy. Trinovantum is Latin for the Welsh Troia Nuith, which means New Troy. And again, I've talked about that endlessly elsewhere. So Trinovantum is the old name for London, New Troy, as they called it. And the Trinovantes were the people from that region, not just London itself, but also the county, you could say, of Essex, really, that was controlled by them, but also the Catiwalani, who were neighbouring, relations. They're very close. And the Catiwalani had already captured that bit of Tubani territory earlier. And again, that's covered in earlier part of this. So Claudius has now assigned that area to his client king, Arviragus. Now, I'm going to show you this map because it's very important. Here we see a map of the western part of southern Britain. And you can see this big road here. I sort of made it rather pink with a highlighter. Running up here, it goes from Exeter down at the bottom here, and it goes up here through Bath and Cirencester, and it goes all the way up to Lincoln. Now this road, the Roman road, we now call the Fosse Way. That's what this road is, and you can drive along it. It goes up through Somerset, and not far from Glastonbury actually. Was originally built as a dike or barrier. So if you have a look at the construction of it, and people have done this, it looks much more like a barrier than a road originally. So it separated the pacified part of Clogres, Britannia Prima, I've written it down here, all this area is pacified here, from the unconquered part of England and Wales here going up. So at this time, this part was still unconquered, so that the Romans built, in the true way they used to do things, build a barrier, cut them out, and the part of the Dubani who were on the east side were now allotted to Britannia Prima. There were other Dubani going all the way down here into Devon and Cornwall, the Corinne. So it appeared that Caratacus' overlordship covered all of Wales, Devon, Cornwall, and those other parts of England west of the Fosse Way and south of the River Trent. So Caratacus has got all this part, Caratacus, plus up into the Midlands of England as well, going all the way up to the River Trent, which flows from, I think, Burton-on-Trent, and it goes through Nottingham. I'm not sure if it comes out at it does come out on the east coast, I think at Hull, but I might be wrong on that. Britannia Secunda, that's that western part I was talking about, was never entirely absorbed into the Roman Empire, as was Britannia Prima. For a time, the Romans retained a military presence at Isca, Caerleon on Usk. That's if you go to Wales in Went, you'll find there's a place called Caerleon, and they advertise Roman fortune. You go there, there's Roman remains there, amphitheatre, great museum, and so on. The Romans built a big encampment there for the 20th Legion, which was led by, I think, Vespasian. Well, he was the second legion. Anyway, they had a big legionary fortress there, but later on that became a town. They withdrew the 20th, and they went back to Cirencester. And they never really occupied Wales the same way, or the southwest, as they did the southeast of England, Britannia Prima. Britannia Secunda had much more independence. And they had another big legionary fortress at Chester, to keep an eye on the Welsh. The Romans call it Diva. So they retained a military presence at Caerleon. This complemented their fortress city of Diva in the north, which we now call Chester. They were kind of keeping that Welsh bit more arm's length and leaving it to the local kings to govern, much as they'd done with Cogidumnus, who's Arviragus, in the south of Britain. So Wales retained its own kings and princes. The people there also retained their own Welsh language. Yeah, they seem to be more distant from the Romans. While the Britons of Logres seem to have mostly adopted Latin. That's what I think. You know, there's this big mystery about why are there so few Welsh names in the countryside for hills and valleys and rivers. And, you know, the word Avon, we have lots of river Avons in England, but Avon in Welsh just means river. So you should have a name telling you what that river is. And you do in Wales, but you don't in England. And it rather suggests to me, anyway, that the people living in Logres fairly quickly stopped speaking Welsh, or British, we should say. Some of them obviously did. You know, maybe more of the aristocracy adopted Latin as the language, you know, to use now. So that, I think, is one reason why Welsh has disappeared, or ancient British, Brittonic, has disappeared from England so entirely. Caradoc was the war leader of many tribes in Wales itself. He was overlord of not just the Silures, but also the powerful tribes of North Wales, the Ordovices and the Deciangli. They've been treated very badly by the Romans. They were no friends of the Romans. And Caradoc Confederation probably also embraced the rest of southern England west of the Fosse Way. So that would be the rest of the Dubonny and the Corney down in the southwest corner and going up into Shropshire and so on, you know, and parts up north as well probably. He may also have been regarded as high king by other tribes to the north of the Thames and east of Wales. And these would likely have included the Cornovii and the Coritani, both of which were powerful tribes. So we've got a confederation being led by this guy Caradoc. In his annals, Tacitus gives a brief but illuminating account of the story of Caratacus. Now we're getting into the nitty-gritty here. Tacitus tells us of a plan by Publius Ostorius Scapula, who took over as governor of the conquered part of Britain from Aulus Plautius in AD 47. So Scapula has taken over in 47. Between AD 47 and 50, Ostorius planned to disarm all the tribes living south of the River Trent and east of the River Severn. Disarmed, they would become slaves. Yeah, well, if you haven't got any arms and you've got a Roman presence there, what are you? You're slaves, basically. And this caused a revolt by the Iceni in AD 50. However, the Romans defeated them in a siege, and their revolt was put down. Seeing this, the other tribes quieted down. Now this is important. This was some 10 years before the more famous Boudica rebellion of AD 60. So what we have here, that the Iceni had actually been friends with Rome during the time of the previous Aulus Plautius, when he was governor. But this new boy on the block, Ostorius Scapula, stirs everything up by proposing to disarm them and all the other tribes, treating them like vassals. Not content with this victory, Ostorius pushed on west of the River Severn. His troops first invaded North Wales into the territory of the Deciangi. They who lived in what is now Gwynedd. Here the Romans ravaged the territory and took away a lot of booty. He almost reached the Irish Sea, but a rising of the Brigantes forced him to withdraw. The Brigantes lived in what is now the north of England. Their territory encompassed Northumberland, Cumberland, Durham, and parts of Lancashire and Yorkshire, and they too were pacified. So he's done terrible things in North Wales to the Deciangi, taken all their booty, and there's a lot of gold. The famous gold. I forget what they call it in the British Museum. Sort of you would put it over you, perhaps a priest's thing. It looks only fit a child, actually. Maybe it was on a statue originally, a pagan statue. But there was gold in Wales, North Wales had been, so this is probably some of the booty that he took, things like this. He nearly got to the Irish Sea, but he had to go back because the North British were threatening to invade. So he had to go and pacify the Brigantes. So he caused an awful lot of trouble, this guy, in a very short time, when things had been reasonably quiet before that. Tacitus writes, neither sternness nor leniency prevented the Silures from fighting. He goes on, the natural ferocity for the inhabitants was intensified by their belief in the prowess of Caratacus, whose many undefeated battles and even many victories had made him preeminent among British chieftains. So this is Tacitus's annals for the years AD 47 to 51. So this is a period of Scapula causing havoc in North Wales. Caratacus chose a particular hill, since called Caer Caradoc, for a great win or lose battle. Tacitus tells us how before the battle he rallied his troops. They were drawn from many tribes. Caratacus, as he hastened to one point and another, stressed that this was the day, this the battle, which would either win back their freedom or enslave them forever. He invoked their ancestors, who, by routing Julius Caesar, had valorously preserved their present descendants from Roman officials and taxes, and their wives and children from defilement. These exhortations were applauded. Then every man swore by his tribal oath that no enemy weapons would make them yield, and no wounds either. So this is in his annals for AD 50. As it turned out, the Romans were just too strong to fight in a large day's battle. Smaller skirmishes and guerrilla raids were one thing, but taking on whole legions with auxiliaries, especially when the Britons had no armour, was something else. The battle lost, Caratacus' wife, daughter and brother were taken prisoner. He himself escaped and went for help to Cartimandua, queen of the powerful Brigantes tribe of northern England. So the Brigantes had risen earlier. He's now gone to her, say, look, come and help us, we almost managed to do it. Another shove and we might drive these Romans out. But She, fearing a similar fate, betrayed him to the Romans. Then Caratacus and his whole family were sent back to Rome. He expected to be paraded in triumph before being strangled and his body thrown into the Tiber. That was the usual fate of Rome's opponents. The rest of his family would be enslaved. So that's what happened to Vercingetorix at the time of Caesar. And that was what they used to do, have a big celebration. We'd conquer this barbarian king, he calls himself a king, he's just a barbarian. And we'll parade him and show how strong we Romans really are. And then we'll get rid of him. We'll strangle him and throw him into the river as the trash he is. That's what he could expect. In Rome, something extraordinary happened. Caratacus and his family were brought before Claudius and Agrippina, his wife, as they chaired the Senate. It's very unusual to have her in there. Everyone in Rome was aware that he had been fighting against the Roman occupation of Britain for 9 long years. So the Romans invaded in 43 and it was now 52. Enemy or not, he was a celebrity of the First Order, and so the Senate was packed. Instead of quivering with fear, as might be expected, Caratacus stood tall and proud. Coming to the podium, he made a famous speech, and Tacitus reproduces the gist of it in his Annals of Imperial Rome. Had my lineage and rank been accompanied by only moderate success, I should have come to this city as friend rather than prisoner, and you would not have disdained to ally yourself peaceably with one so nobly born, the ruler of many nations. As it is, humiliation is my lot, glory yours. I had horses, men, arms, wealth. Are you surprised I am sorry to lose them? If you want to rule the world, does it follow that everyone else welcomes enslavement? If I had surrendered without a blow before being brought before you, neither my downfall nor your triumph would have become famous. If you execute me, they will be forgotten. Spare me, and I shall be an everlasting token of your mercy. And that's written in Tacitus' Annals, book 12. Now then, to everyone's amazement, Claudius responded by pardoning him, along with his wife and brothers. They were released from their chains. Perhaps indicating her importance in this decision, that's Claudius and his family, offered homage to Agrippina as well as to Claudius. And Tacitus remarks, that a woman, Agrippina, should sit before Roman standards was an unprecedented novelty. They don't normally have women there sitting among the standards. She was asserting her partnership in the empire as her ancestors had run. And you have to understand here that Agrippina was a great-granddaughter of Augustus, who was the first emperor. And she was a daughter of General Germanicus, who was also descended from Augustus. And she would later poison her husband Claudius. So she was saying, I'm really important as well, Claudius is great, okay, yeah, but I'm the power behind the throne. Don't you forget it. And as I say, she later poisoned him, and she was put to death for that. The condition for release was that Caratacus and his family should never again bear arms against Rome. Furthermore, they were constrained to remain in Rome for 7 years. After this time, they could return home if they wanted to. This is very strange, isn't it? As befitting his rank, Caratacus is a king, as he said, of many peoples. Caratacus was given a palace on top of the Esquiline hill. It became known as the Palatium Britannicum, or Palace of the British. Wow, this is extraordinary, that not only is he not strangled and thrown in the Tiber, but he's been given a palace. They built one for him, if it wasn't already there. and he's being treated as royalty. And it was clearly Claudius' hope that 7 years would be long enough for them to become Romanized, enjoying the comforts of civilization. Now, this is his real genius of Claudius. I think Claudius was one of the best Roman emperors because he was so clever. He was not the brute that all the rest of them seem to have been. Caratacus could then return home to Britain as a client king, as had been done with Arviragus in lowland southern Britain. So this was Caratacus' plan all along. He wanted to create another line of client kings, just as he had done in Britannia Prima. He would have a set of client kings in Britannia Secunda. And he Romanized them first of all, roll off the rough edges, get them wearing togas, get them to enjoy Roman food, get them to take on Roman ways, maybe teach them Latin if they didn't already speak it, but it looks like Caratacus already did, or he couldn't have made that speech. Get them Romanized, and then when they've got used to the fine living, higher civilization, send them back, and then build them a palace back there, if you like, as well. Get them running their country, and in time it will become so Roman that they won't notice that they are taken over completely and incorporated fully into the Roman Empire. That's his plan. That's a good one. However, something very unexpected happened. Members of Caratacus' family, and maybe also himself, converted to Christianity. Now, there's some dispute over this. According to one tradition, they were already Christians even before the Roman invasions. According to this version of events, as told by 6th century monk Gildas, Christianity came to Britain during the last year of Tiberius Caesar, and that means AD 36-7. So we have a dichotomy here. Did they convert when they're in Rome, or were they already Christians before they even got there? And we'll discuss that in the next lecture. But I'm going to carry on with the Roman connection now of what happened to them in Rome. So it is possible that the Silurian royal family were already Christians even before coming to Rome. What everyone agrees about is that the first convert was Bran Vendigade, Bran the Blessed. So everyone will tell you that the first British Christian recorded was Bran the Blessed. That's probably why he's called the Blessed. He opened the door, and he was the father of Caratacus. And he'd been king, but he had handed over rulership. This is common practice among these British kings. When they get to a certain age, they hand over the day-to-day running of the kingdom, or the empire, whatever it is, to the son, while they retire to concentrate on their spirituality, perhaps, or their, anyway, their retirement. Now, if you have watched the previous video in this series, we discussed how Claudius ordered the building of a palace and city at Chichester for King Arviragus, who married his daughter. In return, and to honour Claudius, the king, also known as Cogidumpnus, commissioned a temple of Neptune and Minerva to be built. And that's what this plaque is all about, Neptune eternally at Minervae Templum. And it tells how it's built on the orders of the Lord Divine. And he also takes the name Claudius Cogidumpnus, Tiberius Claudius Cogidumpnus. So this king, Cogidumpnus, has taken the names of Claudius. He's been adopted into the Claudian family to do that. So this is actually Arviragus. And he builds a temple, and the person overseeing the actual building work and the donations for it is someone, we've lost a few letters here, but his name is Pudente, son of Pudentinus. So this guy is called Pudenti. So who's Pudens? Well, we're going to find out a lot about him now as we progress. Thus we know that Pudens had been in Britain during these critical years. The plaque indicates that he knew Togodumnus, Arviragus, who Claudius endorsed as king of lowland Britain. That's what Arviragus means. It means king of the lowlands, or king of the ploughed land, which is lowland Britain. We also know that the Pudentini, or family from which the Pudens came, was upper class and of senatorial rank. It seems likely that Pudens had returned to Rome with Aulus Plautius in AD 47. Postings to different parts of the empire were normally only for a few years. So you went and did a bit of service in Britain, and you might be sent off to Yugoslavia or Egypt or anywhere else in the empire. They didn't want you to be too long in any one place to build up a power base, basically. And also, when you went to different parts of the empire, there was opportunities, more in some places than others, to make a bit of cash for yourself with bribes and authorizing certain things and all that kind of thing, taking a cut. And this is how you got rich if you were an aristocrat. So you went and did your service in certain places, and then you took your cut, and then you retire back to Rome to carry on your senatorial career. So, Pudens would almost certainly have been in Rome in AD 51 when Caratacus made his sensational speech. As a veteran from the earlier British campaign, he would have undoubtedly have attended in the Senate that day. If so, he would likely have met the Silurian royal family. He may even have already known them from his time in Britain. So we got this guy Pudente, of the Pudentini family. He's a senator, and he's come back from Britain a few years earlier with Aulus Plautius, who he's been working for, organising things like building this temple for Cogidubnus in Chichester. Now he's come back to Rome. Well, this famous Caratacus has come. He'd been captured and brought to Rome. He's now going to be standing in the Senate. Do you think Pudens is not going to be there? Of course he is. He's going to want to see what this guy's like. Maybe even knew him before, in his time of Britain. All evidence points to what at first may seem a very unlikely union. Pudens married a daughter of Caratacus called Claudia. You might think that that's extraordinary. How could that possibly happen? Well, I'm going to show you evidence shortly. Evidence for this is provided by the poet Marcus Valerius Martial, who was born in Spain between AD 38 and 42. Although he was resident in Rome later, from AD 64 to 98, he evidently knew the Pudens family. It is perfectly possible that Martial met Claudia, or at least admired her from afar. He certainly admired her. Either way, either in Rome or earlier in Britain, Rufus Pudens, too, became a convert to Christianity. He lived, quite literally, round the corner from the Palatium Britannicum. That's where the Pudens family had their family villa. It was on the road leading up to the Esquiline Hill, only round the corner, not 200 yards from the Palatium Britannicum. His house, now a church, has recently been the subject of archaeological investigation. Underneath the present-day Church of St. Pudentiana, there is intact the earlier senatorial villa of her ancestors. That's the ancestors of Saint Pudentiana. Pudens did marry Claudia, the younger daughter of King Caratacus. Her name in Welsh was Gladys, and it seems likely that she was so named after the Emperor Claudius. She may even have been adopted by him, that's Claudius, as was also the Roman way. Very often, the Romans, particularly emperors, and particularly Claudius, would adopt important heiresses or heirs or people that he liked into his family. That then gives him some authority as to who they should marry. And that's how you can engineer important marriages. So I want to give you now the family of the British saints in Rome, and we're going to be discussing this in some detail shortly. So this is the family of the British saints in Rome. So we have, at the top here, we have Bran the Blessed, Bran Vendigade. And then we have King Caratacus here. And apparently he had a sister called Gladys Pomponia Graecina, who married Aulus Plautius. He was the first governor of Britain. And then we have here the children of Caradoc, Caeleen and Cunnan and Linus. Caelenus becomes king. Cunnan, I think, is one of the brothers. Linus is another brother. He becomes first bishop of Rome. I'll talk about that in a minute. Saint Urgine, we'll talk about her in due course as well. Urgine would be Eugenie in this day and age, and it's the same name as Igerna, who was the mother of King Arthur. So that's a Welsh name, Urgine. She marries someone called Salog, who's the Lord of Salisbury. And then there's this one Gladys, Claudia, who marries Rufus Pudens, and she's possibly adopted by Claudius I. That's Claudius. And they have these children, Saint Timotheus, Saint Pudentiana, Saint Praxedes or Praxidae, and Saint Novatus. So that's the family, and we're going to look into that a bit more now and what happened. Now, in his epigrams, Martial writes, "Red-haired Claudia, who came over, veiled foreign woman of Pudens, the food having meaning of worshipping the gods of marriage thou art. Such high degrees of beauty are rarely joined together, confusing endearments and sweet poses of perception." So you can gather from this that this is in Martial's Book 2, Epigram 54. You can look it up if you don't believe me. He obviously rather fancied Claudia. He must have seen her, although she would have been somewhat older when he was in Rome. And he writes here again, he elaborates further on the subject of Claudia in another epigram. "Veiled Claudia, with eagerness red-haired Britain. For what reason, published in the Latin tongue, blamed in the mind of the multitude? Of what form of dishonour? The Romans believe in given marriage. Women of Italy possess good sense of discernment pertaining to exhortation, to judge well where sanctity is enrobed." So he's saying that, why is the mob against her? We believe in marriage. She's foreign, she's married, but she's a very saintly person, a very good person. And the women of Italy have always, endorsed that good sense of good behaviour. So that's in his Book 4, Epigram 13. Clearly, Martial liked Claudia and admired both her good looks and apparent sanctity. He even seems to be springing to her defence when, or so it would seem, she is being blamed by the mob for something. He also praises her upholding of the sanctity of marriage itself, reminding Romans that this is their own traditional way. All this hints that there was something more than her being British that annoyed the mob. That something was most likely her devotion to Christianity. There is a tradition that Claudius got along very well with Caratacus and his family. He admired the Briton for his courage both as a war leader and as a captive. In any case, it was his policy, where possible, to conquer by peaceful means. He believed it was better to make friends with those you have vanquished than to kill them and have them replaced by further enemies. What a sensible man. Claudius himself also seems to have been quite interested in the then new religion of Christianity. At any rate, he seems to have tolerated it. So there weren't persecutions of Christians at the time of Claudius, not that I've ever seen. That all came later. Now, the house of Pudens and Claudia was where the Apostle Paul would stay while in Rome. After the deaths of Pudens and Claudia, their house passed to their children. Their son Linus was the first bishop of the Gentile church in Rome. And so this house, and later the church built over it, was Rome's cathedral. Now, I'll just say a couple of words here. That there were two churches in Rome. There was a convert Jewish church, which was founded by Peter, and there was a Gentile church, which, as far as we can tell, was founded by Paul. And the two at first weren't involved with each other. Remember that the Jews had all sorts of their own requirements, including circumcision, to become a Jew. So if the Gentiles didn't want to do that, they were a bit suspicious of them and didn't want to have anything to do with them. But they could still become Christians. And later on, the two churches did merge. But in the early days, this seems to have been the cathedra, the place where the chair was of the Bishop of Rome, and who was Linus, the first one. So he was consecrated by Paul and founded with the first Gentile church. And it remained so. It remained the Cathedral of Rome until AD 313, when the Emperor Constantine donated the Lateran Palace to the Christians. Since then, St. John's Lateran has been Rome's cathedral. So this is not the Cathedral of Rome today, but it is the original. A very, very holy site, you could say. And hardly visited by people. Actually, it's two sisters, Saints Prudensiana and Praxedes, continued to live in the house, but also seem to have owned the Palatium Britannicum, inherited from their grandfather Caratacus. So these are two daughters of Pudens, and who remained unmarried as far as we can tell. And they're remembered for their bravery in recovering the bodies of early Christian martyrs for burial. The mosaic in the apse dates from the late 4th to early 5th centuries AD. It is the oldest Christian mosaic in Rome. It shows Jesus Christ robed in gold with imperial trim to show he is the supreme ruler. He sits on his throne, blesses with his right hand, and holds in his left a text that reads, Dominus Conservator Ecclesiae Pudentianae, Lord Conserver of the Church of Pudentiana. So he's giving blessings and protection to this particular church of Pudentiana. The official view, that's what you read online and you probably read it in guidebooks and things, is that the seated figures represent the apostles. So you've got Jesus there and all these seated figures, while the standing women serving them are symbolic figures representing church and synagogue. That's what I've read. I don't believe it. You can read the picture itself and it tells you what it is. It seems to me much more likely that the group of men are represented on the left, as we face. This is Jesus is right, but on our left are senators. You can see they're wearing senatorial costume. They're wearing togas with those bands, which shows they're senators. And they represent the Gentile church. And on the right, you've got St. Peter and St. Paul, plus other Christian Jews, and perhaps Claudia. In other words, the two churches, Jewish and Gentile, are uniting under Jesus Christ. That's what I think this is talking about, how this church is bringing together the two congregations, the Jewish congregation and the Gentile congregation. And I think it's possible that the two serving figures are Pudentiana and Prassidae. If not, they represent the two different churches, the Gentile church and the Jewish church, but they're being united under Christ. It is recorded that Pudentiana and Prassidae would go out at night to retrieve the bodies of Christian martyrs. They would bring them back to the Palatium Britannicum for burial. Because their family was of senatorial status and they were women, they could get away with this. However, they were eventually martyred themselves, as were virtually all the other members of their family. It may even have been all of them, I don't know. But anyway, they were collecting up the bodies, and this would be particularly in the time of Nero, when he was emperor, and again under Domitian, and that's probably when they were killed, at the time of Domitian, when they were probably quite old by then. Anyway, sad story. At the top of the Esquiline Hill, facing the huge basilica of St. Mary Maggiore, stands the church of St. Prassidae, also called Praxedes. The doorway and facade is plain to the point of insulting for such an old and important church. By all accounts, it stands on the site of the Palatium Britannicum, once the home of Caratacus and family in Rome. That property was much larger, probably encompassing St. Mary Maggiore too. In other words, that would have extended over the whole hilltop there, this big palace of the British. But much later, bits were taken away and sold off or acquired by the state for other things, acquired by the church. And you have the big basilica of St. Mary Maggiore built there, which has its own legends too. Inside the church of St. Prassidae is perhaps the most beautiful, inside the church of St. Prassidae is perhaps the most beautiful in all of Rome. While it may not have the same size and grandeur of some larger basilicas, notably St. Peter's, it is much more ancient. It is graced with Byzantine mosaics and other detailing that is rare in Western churches. These were installed during the Carolingian Renaissance of the early 9th century. Thus the church has a decidedly Byzantine feel to it. And it is well worth visiting when in Rome. Now, I've been to this church. It's absolutely gorgeous. These beautiful mosaics and the flooring and everything. Wonderful. And I do recommend if you get the chance, make a trip. If you're in Rome, go and have a look at this church. It will be worth your time. And visit St. Pudentiana at the same time, which is just down the hill a bit. Underneath the church are extensive catacombs. These are said to contain the mortal remains of thousands of martyrs and also the bodies of 13 popes. 13 popes buried there. Not in St. Peter's, they're buried here. Pudentiana and Prassidae are also buried there. Their tombs, you can see their tombs if they'll let you into the catacombs with their names written on them. However, not all of the bodies now in the catacombs were buried there by them. Yeah, they buried a lot of the martyrs at their own time. But there are other martyrs from much later. And during the reign of Pope Paschal, AD 817 to 24, that's in the 9th century, again, the time when this church was being beautified with all these mosaics, it is said that many other Christian skeletons were transferred to these catacombs. So he brought them into this very holy place at that time for protection. Among the visitors to the church in medieval times was King Alfred the Great of Wessex. He came to Rome on pilgrimage with his father in 855 to 6. It had a very profound effect on him, so perhaps he heard something of the church's connection with the early British church at the time of Caratacus. Another famous visitor, or rather parishioner, of this church was Saint Birgitta, Bridget of Sweden. She spent over 20 years living in Rome after her husband died, and she founded an order of nuns. She is said to have prayed regularly in the church of Saint Praxedes, so she knew a nice church to become a parishioner of. Presumably she lived in the Esquiline Hill area, I don't know, during that time. She did eventually return to Sweden. So there we have it, my friends. It seems this confluence between the early British and the apostles, and I should have mentioned that Pudens and Timothy and Pudentiana, or Claudia, I should say, Claudia and Pudens and Timothy are mentioned by St. Paul in his letter to Timothy. So you can see that there is this real connection, and this is where he would have stayed when he was in Rome. He would have stayed at the house of Pudens and Claudia. They were his friends as well as his converts, and that's a very, very special place. And so there is this British connection with Rome going way back to the beginnings of Christianity. And in the next lecture, we'll talk about how Christianity came to Britain in the first place. And as I say, there's more than one way of looking at that story. So thank you very much for your time. And as I say, I'll put the links to the other episodes below. And I look forward to talking with you again. Bye for now.